Tonight we set sail into the cold, churning waters of the Irish Sea, to a place where the rocks are sharp, the waves relentless, and the wind never stops howling around the lighthouse. But this true story is not about the light. It's about the deep darkness of being stranded on a death rock, with a storm outside and a mind beginning to crack. This is a true case of isolation and paranoia, and a rotting hand that came knocking. So light your lamp, close the door tight to keep out the cold, because tonight you're about to face the horror at Smalls Lighthouse. There's something about lighthouses. They stand watch over the sea, their light slicing through the dark. They're beautiful, yes, but lonely too, when you think about it. They're kind of haunted even when they're not haunted. I considered staying alone in one once. Yes, during the lockdowns of 2021, I applied for a job, a very strange one. The Göteborg Film Festival in Sweden had been cancelled due to the pandemic. But instead of shelving the event, they hatched an idea that felt like something from a horror story. They would show films as planned, but to an audience of just one. Not in a cinema, not even in a house, but inside the isolated lighthouse of Paranoia. Paranoia is perched on a barren cluster of rocks called Hamnesha. It's 5 kilometers out to sea, accessible only by boat or helicopter. There's no internet, no phone, no company, just one person for 1 week and 60 film premieres. It sounded to me both amazing and scary, and frankly probably too scary to be honest. But I still applied. But as I waited to hear if I'd been chosen, I started doing a bit of research on lighthouses, and that's when I came across this story. And suddenly, all the romanticism about a lighthouse was gone, and when I eventually found out that I didn't get the job, I was beaten by a nurse called Lisa Enroth, I was really quite relieved. Because ever since reading about what happened to 2 lighthouse keepers off the coast of Wales, I don't know if I would have ever gotten any sleep on that island. And after tonight, maybe you won't either. Well, the horror took place not at Paranoia, but at Smalls Lighthouse. Smalls Lighthouse stands on a craggy splinter of rocks about 21 miles off the coast of St David's Head in Wales. These days, it's a modern and automated building, and there's no need for humans to operate the place. But back in 1801, it was a different story. Now, you might imagine a classic lighthouse, a tall white tower with a bold red stripe and a glowing beacon up top. But the original small structure was a spindly, awkward thing. Built around 1776, it was more like a narrow octagonal hut perched on 9 legs made of oak and lashed with iron. It was barely holding together to begin with, but the records say that the cabin would sometimes even sway in fierce winds. And still, 2 men were sent there, charged with keeping the light alive. Both were named Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith. And that, it turns out, was the only thing these 2 Thomases had in common. You see, they didn't get along. Which was tricky, since once they arrived on the rock, they found themselves living together in a space that was roughly 4.5 meters across, about the size of a garden shed. They slept, ate, and worked in that claustrophobic space, 21 miles from the nearest human soul. Now, who's to say how strained things were in that cramped, creaking room? Did they argue together loudly or sit in cold silence, refusing to speak? We'll never know for sure. But whatever tension hung in the air was nothing compared to what happened next. Because everything changed when Thomas Griffith suffered a freak accident on Smalls Rock. I'm not sure what caused it. In fact, some sources even call it an illness, but others an accident. Whatever it was, Howell, his colleague, knew that he needed to raise the alarm to get medical help for the other Thomas. But the weather had turned savage, making it impossible to summon aid from such a remote location, and the rudimentary communication systems of the time were just not up to the task. With no way to reach the mainland, and the storm showing no signs of mercy, Howell could do nothing but watch Griffith grow worse and worse. I found references saying that Griffith was in agony during that time, and Howell was helpless. He would go outside looking for a break in the clouds, but it never came. And he went inside looking for a turn in Griffith's condition. That never came either. And eventually, as the thunder growled outside, Griffith wheezed out a final painful breath and died. which left Thomas Howell utterly alone on the storm-battered rock. Now, Howell may not have cared much for Griffith, but at least he'd been someone, a voice, a presence. Now there was only silence. And as Howell sat there with this body, something began to rise inside him. Panic. I mentioned already that Howell and Griffith didn't get along, but it's important to know that this wasn't a secret. Everyone on the mainland knew that these two men were not fans of each other. It was even recorded at the time that the two were, quote, reputed to be on bad terms before their stint began. People probably cringed at the idea of them both spending so much time alone together at the Smalls, as it was sometimes known. But now one of them was dead, and Howell wondered, naturally, what if people started to think that he had snapped, driven to madness by the isolation or rage? Could this have led to Howell murdering Griffith? Howell pored over this idea, scared at the implications. When the storm did clear and rescue finally came, how would he even begin to prove that he hadn't killed his colleague? Frantic, Howell began weighing up his options. One idea clawed its way to the surface. Maybe he could drag Griffith's body to the edge of the rocks and roll it into the sea. Let the raging waves carry him off. He could say that Griffith was, swept from the rocks by a violent gust. Gone before he could react, a tragedy. There was another benefit to this plan, of course. At least if he did ditch the body at sea, Howell wouldn't have to eat, sleep, and breathe within whispering distance of a corpse. But even in his spiraling state, he saw the risk. What if the sea gave the body back? Bodies thrown into the waves are often returned, bloated, broken, dragged ashore by the tide days or even weeks later. Or put it another way, the ocean isn't always great at keeping secrets. Now make no mistake, poor Howell was innocent of this man's death. But no matter what he said, no matter how loudly he would deny it, he became convinced that they would march him away as a murderer. And so Howell accepted the grim truth. Like it or not, he would have to keep the body close. There was nowhere else to put him. So for a while after Griffith's death, the body remained where it was, in the tiny space the two men had lived in, lying there motionless in the corner of a cramped circular room, barely a meter or two from where Howell ate, slept, and sat. Maybe he draped a cloth over the body's face, but it didn't help. The shape of that corpse was still there, silent and unmoving maybe, but it's strange what sounds you can hear in a creaking old structure like that. And what a flickering shadow from a candle can make you think you saw as you stare at this thing for hours on end. And then, of course, there was the smell. The psychological weight of the dark lump in the room grew unbearable. And so finally, in an attempt to reclaim just a sliver of control, Howell set to work building something. A coffin. The records say that he, quote, cobbled together a wooden crate from the bulkhead planking. And he hammered the boards together as the bitter wind howled and screamed around the lighthouse, all while Griffith lay there motionless. And it took Howell a few days, but he did it because he was good at this. He'd worked with wood before as a barrel maker. He knew how to measure, how to cut, how to build. Now, building the box was one thing, but filling it was something else entirely. But now it was finished, that time had come. Howell braced himself and prepared for the task he did not want to do, to touch the body. And so with hands that barely obeyed him, he leaned over and reached beneath the corpse's stiffening limbs, and he tugged and shimmied and lifted it and dragged it towards the coffin. It can't have been easy, putting the body in that box by himself, but when Griffith was finally inside, Howell sealed the lid, and maybe he felt some flicker of relief. But after so long staring at the dead man's face, I'm sure a little piece of timber wasn't quite enough to block the image of the twisted face glaring up at him through the wood. Well, Griffith was now out of sight, but he wasn't gone. Not really. And Howell was still living, eating, and working and trying to sleep in the lighthouse barely 5 meters across, with a coffin that, once built, stretched across nearly half the room. So perhaps we can understand why Howell made his next choice. He couldn't keep it inside. Instead, he gritted his teeth, opened the creaking door to the freezing gale, and dragged the coffin out into the bitter night air. Even then, he wasn't free of the worry. If he did leave the coffin just sitting there outside, what about the wind? What if an ocean wave, wild and cruel, reached up and stole the body away? And so, soaked by spray and shivering in the cold, he fetched a length of rope. And with fingers numb, he tied the coffin, lashing it to the exterior railing on a part known as the gallery, just below the window of the hut. And he secured it as tightly as he could, and only then did he return inside and breathe again. Now he would just have to wait for the malicious storm to calm down so that help would come. We don't know precisely how long Howell remained trapped in that hellish situation, but historians believe it could have been anything from 3 weeks to 3 or 4 months. All that time of shrieking winds, slamming waves, and the ever-present weight of the coffin just outside the wall. Imagine trying to sleep through that. Not just the loneliness of the coffin, but he still had that same fear. Would he get accused of murder by the end of it? They might not see a survivor when they picked him up, but a killer who, for some twisted reason, wanted to keep his victim close to him on the outer walls of the lighthouse. Well, Howell's paranoia was growing more and more intense as his namesake began to rot out there in the cold. There are official ship logs from the time that record the entries of passing vessels at this precise time. And they include mundane details saying that the light at Smalls Rock was still shining, still doing its job, all seemed well. But there are other reports of other ships who saw, quote, signals of distress flying on the lighthouse. But at the time, there wasn't a standard code for lighthouse emergencies, so some didn't understand what they meant. The boat crews that did understand tried to reach the lighthouse, but the storm made landing impossible. And so they sailed on, leaving a sleep-deprived man sinking into madness. And then, as if the situation wasn't ghastly enough, it got much worse. Because that's when the storm turned on the coffin itself. Despite Howell's carpentry skills, the elements proved stronger. Day after day, the wind tore at the box, the rain battered it, the salt water warped the timber, and in all this strain from the elements, the nails began to give. And what started as creaking soon became a loud groaning. Was it the coffin moaning in the gale, or Griffith letting out a long dead sigh, calling for Howell to come back outside and bring him in? And all the while, that corpse rocked gently back and forth in its splintering box. Howell rocked too, on the floor of the lighthouse, head in his hands, trying not to listen. Then, one night, the wind struck hard, a vicious gust, more brutal than the rest. And it was finally enough. Enough to split that coffin open. Not completely. It was just a hairline crack at first, but wide enough for part of the corpse to shift. And the reports tell us that from that narrow seam, Griffith's arm slid out. Long, bloated, and dripping. By now, rigor mortis had set in, which stiffens the muscles. Decomposition would have caused the tendons and muscles to shrink, and the windy, salty environment would have made the skin and tissues retract. It's a process called desiccation, and that process will expose the fingernails, giving the illusion that they have grown much longer. And so as this dead arm lolled about, the fingers would have looked like curled, horrid, like a monstrous-looking claw. And Howell knew something was wrong before he even went there to check the wood, because when the wind was strong enough to crack that coffin, It was strong enough to lift what was inside the coffin. And Howell could not have possibly realized the risk he took by placing the coffin near to the window. Now he must have desperately wished he hadn't, because he started to hear a weird sound that he hadn't before. A tapping against the pane of glass. And when he looked over, he was utterly appalled to see Griffith's putrefied hand pressing against the window pane to get in. And then the hand would swing away wildly, lolling in the darkness, and then press back against the glass. The curled, long fingernails tapping against the window, scraping. That would be enough to push most people to the edge. But for Howell, it may have gone further than that. Because the storm didn't end. It raged for weeks and weeks, unforgiving and endless. And Howell remained stranded, his only companion, a rotting body that tapped and swayed just beyond the wall. There are chilling reports from other ships at the time. Entries in onboard logs of passing vessels. Some continue to note that the light at Smalls was still operating, still doing its job, so there was no real cause for alarm. But some of the crew even peered through their telescopes during the day, and they claimed to see a figure standing awkwardly near a window. This could have been Howell, of course, frantically waving for help. Or were they actually seeing the body of Griffith, still tied to the gallery railing by the rope, but now freed from the coffin entirely? The storm had shattered the box, and his corpse now flailing in the wind, jerking and twisting like a nightmarish puppet, a scarecrow made of bone and skin and spray and madness. And no ship came close enough to see the truth. No one intervened. But then, at last, the storm began to ease, and after weeks and months of torment, a standard relief vessel finally left the port of Milford and made its slow way across the sea to Smalls Rock. At long last, someone would check up on the two men who had braved such a fierce storm together. When docked at the lighthouse edge, they climbed onto the rocks and met a nightmare. Griffith's body was now barely human. He had become a horrendous and rotting ghoul, deformed by the elements. The weather had broken and warped him into something hideous. And Howell, who had been trapped with that monster for every second of every day and night, had now lost his mind. And when they found Howell, he was haggard, and the witnesses described him as, quote, a broken man. His hair had turned completely white during the ordeal, it said in the reports. They helped him onto the boat and finally set off onto the very same sea that had so completely trapped him all of these weeks. And as the lighthouse shrank behind them, swallowed by the sea and the sky, the man they took with him was not the same man who had once been posted there before. Because the ghost of Smalls Rock, whether real or imagined, had come home with him. He truly was haunted for the rest of his life. Now, at least Howell wasn't charged with murder as he had feared. Ironically, he shouldn't have worried, because it was clear to them when they looked at Griffith that he had died of natural causes. And yet they say people barely recognized Howell when he returned to the mainland. It wasn't just his hair and his body that was stooped. His mind was gone. It was altered. Who knows if he ever truly slept again? Especially on those stormy nights when the breeze was up and the fingers of a winter tree tapped against the windows of his home, just to remind him of that time when it rained so long that it washed his sanity away. The Smalls Rock Lighthouse incident is not a folk tale or a legend. It's recorded as a factual event in lighthouse logs and reports, and as such it would leave a lasting mark on British maritime policy. Until then, it had been standard practice to send only 2 men to these remote outposts, no backups, no regular checks. But after what happened to Howell and Griffith, that all changed. From that point on, there would always be 3 keepers, at least during the winter months, just in case. Investigators called the wooden lighthouse a raft of timber crudely put together, And yet that same structure held on for decades. Then in 1861, it was finally replaced with a new tower, this time built of stone and standing 41 meters tall. A helicopter deck was added in 78, and then in 1987, the lighthouse became fully automated. From then on, keepers weren't needed, and so the place remained lifeless and empty, though some people say that Griffith still walks there. Maybe you can hear him tapping on the windows in the storm. The automation of lighthouses would, of course, mean the end of a long-held occupation. These lighthouse keepers really were heroes, braving the elements, the isolation, the crushing loneliness, so that countless ships and boats could get home safely. And I sometimes wonder why Howell didn't just turn out the light. Surely that would have alerted the passing ships that something was amiss. Indeed, when you read through the reports, you find that because he didn't turn out the light, people just assumed it wasn't that bad over there, and they didn't make as much of an effort as they would have if the light had gone out. I think they would have come to his aid much sooner if he had just switched them off. But maybe, even in his terror, he couldn't bring himself to risk other people's lives. Maybe he chose to lose his mind rather than let another boat smash against the rocks. Unless, of course, it's simpler than that. Maybe he was just too afraid, too petrified to snuff out the one remaining flicker of light on that rock. Because if he did, he'd be left in pitch blackness, alone yet not really alone, with the horror at Smalls Lighthouse. I'm Peter Laws, and you've been listening to Into the Fog. Good night.